Congratulations on setting up your VLX network. In this example, we have two encoder devices and one decoder device on our VLX network. If you're having issues finding your devices, please take a look at our video on setting up a VLX network. In this video, we'll take a look at all the common features in the VLX Manager. As you can see at the top here, we have a bar with a few options for our view. For example, we can change the sort ordering of the devices to be either the IP address or possibly firmware version or stream address. We can also change whether it's ascending or descending. We could also change the layout from horizontal to vertical and the device view themselves from detailed to simple. For this video, we will keep it in a detailed orientation. Now let's take a look at the device tile itself. This first line shows the host name of the device. By default, all VLX devices start with VLX-Series either encoder or decoder, depending on the device type, dash the last 4 digits of the serial number. On the second line, we see the IP address of the device. On the line below that, we have the firmware version currently installed on the device. Beneath that, we have some information that's specific to the context of the tab that you're on. Right now, we're on the matrix switching tab, so we see the multicast address of the HDMI video routing. Below that is whether or not the stream is stopped or started. Then, underneath that, we have video resolution information, including the resolution, frame rate, and the color space of the video. In this example, you can see we have a 4K source attached to this encoder. Now let's take a look what happens when we left-click on a device. As you can see, it opens a menu on the side with information specific to that device. This includes a preview stream of whatever HDMI stream is running through the device. Here, it's just a mirror of my desktop. If there was no HDMI stream attached, it will simply say no signal. Now below the preview is the device tag option. Here we can set a custom label for a device. Let's say, for example, room 6. We can then select a color for the tag and then hit save tag. Now as you can see, we have a tag attached to this device that will be visible throughout the Manager application. This is useful if you want to help categorize devices without having to memorize lengthy host names. Below that, we have some quick actions, including starting the HDMI stream, stopping the HDMI stream, and rebooting the device. Below the quick actions is the device locator button. If we click blink on, 2 LEDs on the front of the device will begin blinking. These will be the SFP transmitter and receiver LEDs. This is useful for finding a device in a large setup. And below the device locator, we have some video settings, including which HDMI input is used for a local source and also for a stream source. The difference is a local source plays out of the HDMI out on an encoder, while the stream source is what gets routed to the decoder. And below the video settings, we have audio settings. This allows us to change the audio source for our stream. And finally, all the way at the bottom, are some network settings, which just shows information about the device, such as IP address, gateway, and MAC address. To close the side menu, you can click anywhere in the application. If you find that the side menus are getting in your way, you can always shut them off in the top right corner. Now, let's take a look what happens if we right-click on a device. As you can see, a contextual menu will open up. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of different options here. Let's start from the bottom. Here, we can reboot the device. We can also view the device web page. We can copy some device information. We can open the settings panel. We also can send infrared data and RS-232 serial data via Telnet. We can switch the stream source to HDMI 2 or 1 inputs. We can also set the local display source to be HDMI 2 or 1. We can also get or set the EDID and stop and start the video. Now, if we right-click on a decoder, there's a lot of similar options. However, we also have other options for decoders only, such as Leave Video Channel. This will disconnect our decoder from the encoder video stream. When you first start the manager, you will automatically be in the Matrix Switching tab. You can always look up at the top to see which tab is highlighted. The Matrix Switching tab is used to route HDMI video from encoders to decoders. You can accomplish this by dragging and dropping an encoder onto a decoder device. After you've connected them, you will see that the current device is highlighted in a blue highlight, and any device attached to it is highlighted with a yellow highlight. You can also attach decoders to encoders by just left-clicking each decoder you want to join to that encoder, instead of having to drag and drop every single one. Now, if you want to remove a decoder from an encoder, simply right-click and select Leave Video Channel. Now let's take a look at the VIDEOWALL tab. Video walls are simply rectangular arrangements of monitors, all displaying one image source from an encoder. Each monitor that's part of a wall configuration will have its own decoder attached. You can assign a decoder to a specific monitor by simply dragging and dropping the decoder onto the wall. In this example, we only have one decoder, but if you were to actually make a 2x2 video wall, you would need 4 decoders. Finally, select the encoder source and drag it anywhere onto the wall. This will automatically set the encoder to all decoders on the video wall and automatically scale the video based on the dimensions of the video wall. The Preview Routing tab is identical in function to the Matrix Switching tab. It's used to route HDMI video sources. The only difference being, on this tab, we can see a preview thumbnail of the video. The next tab is the Serial Routing tab. Here, we can route RS-232 data between sender and receiver devices. Unlike video routing, both encoders and decoders can function as senders and receivers. To create routes, simply drag and drop or left-click a sender and left-click each receiver you want to connect. The next tab is our Macro Recall tab. Here, we can create new macros. Macros are a collection of device commands. For example, perhaps we want to create a macro that connects one encoder to 3 decoders. Now, instead of having to manually configure these routes, we could simply fire this macro. You can also select an icon to associate with the macro, and then save it. We now see it appears in our list. To send it, simply left-click. Right-clicking a macro will also allow us to edit or delete the macro. Now you might be wondering, how do I know which commands to use? Well, we have a handy tool on the left side here. This is the macro recording button. For example, if we go back to the Matrix Switching, we could then click on the macro recording button. Now, any routes we create will be saved into this macro. Not only routes, but any device configuration we do. This will allow us to call this macro later. Simply hit the button again to stop, and then enter a name for the macro. Now, anytime we want to repeat that configuration, we simply have to fire this macro. Going into the Edit window, we can see the command that was fired. Now, we can also send these macros from an external device. Check out our video tutorial on the Macro Recall API to see how this is done. The final tab on the VLX Manager is the Firmware Update tab. Here, we can right-click and firmware update either all the devices or an individual device. The firmware that's sent to the device is the one that's selected in this drop-down at the top. We can also import a new firmware file by selecting Choose File. After we have found the firmware file, we hit Import Firmware and then refresh. It should now appear in this drop-down. While doing a firmware update, you cannot send any other commands to the device. For the final part of this video, we will take a look at the device settings. To reach it, right-click a device and click on Settings. This will open a Settings window. By default, it will be open to the General Settings tab. Here, we have a few options. The first one is Auto Sense mode. When enabled, the device will automatically switch inputs if it detects a hot plug. There's also the Lock Front Panel option. This locks the physical buttons on the front of the device. Underneath that is the mode switch. You can switch an encoder to a decoder and vice versa from this menu. Underneath that is some information about the web server. This just includes the MAC address and the serial number of the device. And finally, the unit locator, which is the same as the device locator located in the side menu. Once again, this is useful if you're trying to find a device on a large rack setup. The next tab is the Network Interface tab. Here, we can change the host name of the device and the ID. It's important to note as well that the ID must be 4 digits. If it is not, leading zeros will be added to it. Next is the IP settings of the device, and by default, it is in DHCP mode. You can also set it to static and change the IP address, the mask, and the gateway. On the bottom, we have VLAN ports that we can set for video and Dante. The next tab is the Port tab. This is for RS-232 serial communication. You can set the baud rate, the data bit, the stop bit, and the parity. And finally, on the bottom, we have the SOIP settings. SOIP stands for Storage over IP and is required for IR communication. Next, we have the Debug tab. Here, we can view a property log. This shows us all the property changes on the device since the manager has started. This is very useful for debugging. Below that is the main debugging of the device. This captures debug information on the device itself, and you cannot view it in the manager. And finally, we have the Restore Factory Settings button. This is a factory default. You should only use this if you want to reset your device to an out-of-the-box configuration. The next tab is the Audio Settings tab. Here, we can change the audio source of the stream. We can set it to be either HDMI, line in, or none. We can also change the stream source to be either HDMI 1 or 2. We can also set the 3.5mm analog line in, line out volume, or mute them. We can also set the analog audio source. This can be either HDMI, line in, or Dante. We can set a bitrate limit on our audio source and set the Dante audio source. Under the HDMI decoder tab, we can set the HDCP version and whether or not the support is enabled. HDCP stands for High Definition Content Protection. It's recommended that you have this setting on. Under the Management tab, we can do a backup of our device configuration. We can also upload a saved configuration to a device to restore the settings that we saved. This is really useful to back up your system. It's recommended you do this after initial configuration, and make sure you save these files in a place where you will remember where they are. The next tab is the Authentication tab. This is used to authenticate the device web page. If you were to put the IP address of your device into your browser, you would normally just open up the web page and can edit the settings. However, if you set a username and password, you will need to enter this first. And finally, the Preview tab allows us to set some preview settings. These previews are the ones you see in the Preview Routing tab. You can set the frames per second and the quality from low to high. It's recommended to keep it on 1 frames per second with high quality. Any setting that runs at a higher FPS than this will probably have some issues with missing frames. Next, let's take a look at some decoder device settings. Overall, they are very similar. As you can see, you also start on the General Settings tab. If we look at the Management tab, though, there are a lot more options on a decoder. For example, we can set the splash screen image of the decoder. This is the image that's displayed when there is no source going into the decoder. By default, it is a no signal image. However, you can upload your own JPEG file as long as it's 1920 by 1080 in resolution. You also only have a certain amount of space. If you want to delete the image on the device, just select Delete. The next section is the channel map. This is really useful for IR communication. It allows you to set a map between one symbol and another. This allows for easier interoperability between different manufacturers. You can also upload your own channel map file. And finally, there's the backup settings that are the same as the encoder device. This concludes our VLX Manager guide. For even more in-depth information about the manager and its functions, please check out the user guide available under the Help menu. Thank you for watching.